Offer to purchase Part 2, the inspection contingencies, lines 107 to line 218. The inspection contingency is your buyer's due diligence to make sure there are no hidden defects. The second main reason to do the inspections is so your buyer understands how this machine we call a house operates. I never really liked reading word for word to my buyers, but I made sure in the inspection contingencies that I did just that. So what does ours tell us? Well, it tells us this agreement is subject to the following inspections by a qualified inspector, the buyer's choice, no later than 10 days from the date of acceptance. When the buyer's doing their due diligence, they assume sole responsibility to select and retain the inspector. Of course, you may make recommendations, but finally it's their choice who to use. The seller and our brokerage are held harmless in this selection process. Starting with line 113, we have boldface type because this is so very important to our sellers or to our buyers. If the buyer does not elect inspections, they're working against our best advice, yours and the broker's. They understand that all real property improvements may contain defects and conditions not readily apparent, which could affect the property's use or value. The parties agree that the brokers and agents do not guarantee and in no way assume any responsibility for the property condition. And the buyer acknowledges that it's their duty to exercise reasonable care to inspect and make diligent inquiry of the seller and their inspectors regarding the condition systems of the property. Any inspections required by any state, county, local government, we have several point-of-sale communities in our territory, or FHA/VA do not replace the need for the buyer to have inspections. For those buyers who are doing FHA or VA, it's important they understand those aren't really inspections. It's simply the appraiser pointing out some things they think may be in need of further investigation. Starting in line 121, we talk about the actual protections. First, we urge your buyer to contact the local government to see if there's any uncertified property tax assessments coming due. They also should contact the sheriff's department to see if there's any sex offenders or predators in the neighborhood. The buyer also is urged and advised to perform the following inspections, if applicable, prior to purchase. And we again remind them that physical inspections by appraisers, VA, FHA, city inspectors, health department do not negate the need for private inspections. Starting in line 129 and continuing through line 139, we have a checklist of the commonly requested inspections and then a check for other inspections. We almost always will see the buyer choose a general home inspection. We will then ask for days, in this case let's say 7, and that this is going to be the buyer's choice. We will then look at septic, water, well flow. These are important if the property has well and septic. If they have public sewer and water, of course you're saying no. By the way, every one of these boxes needs to be filled out. Now we get to the other inspections. If by chance they are in an area that does have septic and well, then of course you're going to ask for these tests. The water potability, well flow rate will be done by the buyer, but here's an interesting point I'd like to make here. If the property's located in Geauga County, for example, they have point-of-sale septic inspections, it will then become the seller's responsibility. There's a few other counties that have point-of-sale. You're going to want to know what. If it's in Geauga, down here under specify, you will write in C, Geauga Septic Addendum, and then you will be asked, including that in your purchase agreement. But for these cases, let's say it's on public water, so you don't need these. Now we get into some other Radon and mold didn't used to be in our checkoff, but we added it because it was so commonly suggested by the general home inspector. And in the past, a lot of our agents would check other and under specify, would say, any inspections recommended by general home inspector. And because so many of our agents were doing this, we said you don't need to do that anymore here because lines 141 to 146 cover that. There's the dilemma that some of our agents are now having. They will say, well, we'll wait and see if the general home inspector says we need radon and mold. So they say no. The home inspector, looking in the crawl space, says, geez, there could be some mold down here. We ought to have that tested. And you come back and do others recommended. You think you can get it, even under our thing here. The listing agent is going to come back and say, well, wait, you waived that inspection. So you always want to ask if it may be of a concern. So again, let's ask for them, give 7 days, and make it our buyer's choice, okay? Simply because they've asked doesn't mean they have to do. So why in heaven's name would we have other under here? Well, let's say they have an in-ground pool, and you want the inspection of in-ground pool. That would be one. So you want to have other types. Let's say you have seen a lot of cracks in the foundation. Now here, you're going to ask and specify seller to have foundation inspected and certified by structural engineer. You're going to want to deal with that just like we dealt with other problems. Be sure you're familiar with lines 141 to 146 because this is those other inspections. Your general home inspector is looking at the roof and says, you know, this roof is really showing signs of wear. It's not leaking. I think we should have the roof certified. Or the air conditioner looks pretty worn. The HVAC system seems old. I think you should bring in a HVAC inspector. That's covered by lines 141 through 146. If any of the qualified inspectors who've performed an inspection recommend further detailed inspections, the next line isn't covered when you've written in by general home inspector, or additional inspections are required by the lender. Now, when might that happen? Well, you have an FHA VA buyer. The appraiser goes out and as a condition of the appraisal report says, we need the roof certified. Roof is showing signs of age. We need a roof certification. We need an HVAC, heating, ventilating, air conditioning inspection. So we now cover any by a lender. What's the procedure? Well, the buyer notifies the seller in writing within 3 calendar days of the completion of the last inspection. And then you have 7 additional calendar days from the date of notification to complete these additional inspections. And it goes on to say that all inspections are performed by the contractors of buyer's choice, regardless of which party is paying for the inspections. You may ask the seller to furnish you with one of these inspections, but you will be ordering them for your buyer. The buyer will be ordering them. The seller agrees to provide reasonable access to the party. Now, if you've answered no to any of the above inspections in line 148, your buyer must initial, even if it's not necessary, like a septic inspection when you have sewers. Lines 150 and 151 makes it very clear that if the buyer doesn't do one of the inspections they said yes to, well, it's a waiver of that inspection, just as if you'd said no and you're buying the property and it's as-is condition. So what happens after the inspections are complete? That's covered in lines 153 to lines 165. Now, if your buyer's satisfied at the end of the inspections, well, you're going to use a removal of contingencies form, and within 3 calendar days of the last inspection, you're going to remove the contingencies and move on with the sale. Now, starting almost at the end of line 155, if in good faith your buyer's unsatisfied with any of those inspections, general home inspections, fine. The radon, however, tested out at 5. So you know you need radon mitigation. So if you're unsatisfied with any, the buyer must notify the seller in writing. That's by our removal of contingencies addendum, within 3 calendar days of the completion of the last inspection. What can the buyer do? Well, they must either indicate that they will accept the property if the seller repairs certain material defects that they will list, or what else can they do if they're unsatisfied? They can void the agreement. If buyer and seller agree to a resolution of the unsatisfactory conditions, seller and buyer shall draft and sign a written addendum to this agreement, setting forth the terms of that resolution. If a resolution of unsatisfactory conditions cannot be reached within 5 calendar days of the buyer's written notice to the seller, 5 days to negotiate and agree, then the agreement's null and void. Now, while we say the seller's repair, sometimes the seller will come back and say, look, we aren't going to do all these repairs, but we will reduce the purchase price. That's acceptable and can be done on the removal of contingencies. If they're not going to go forward or they haven't come to agreement, the parties agree to sign a mutual release. Upon receipt of the release, the escrow agent will distribute the monies in accordance with the terms of the release. In bold, again, very important, in the event buyer does not inspect the property within 10 calendar days of this date of this agreement, then buyer waives all rights to any inspection. Any contingency pursuant to this paragraph shall be removed, and the buyer agrees to accept the property in its as-is condition. A quick note, if you are a listing agent and you are receiving a purchase offer from a co-broke, someone in an office other than our brokerage here in Solon, read this section on their contract very, very carefully. Some co-brokes have language that state they will give the seller agrees to accept all written inspection reports if they ask for any repair whatsoever. That's not necessarily in your seller's best interest. Some say if they decide to sign a mutual release, they will send you the report. And if your seller doesn't want it, you need to cross that out. Not everyone waits until the last inspection. So again, read this part of the offer from a co-broke very carefully. It will not be like ours. Starting in line 167, we talk about extension of dates. Yes, if you need more time. The sellers agreed to get the septic inspected, but the county can't come out for another month. Whatever it is, you can extend those as long as it is done prior to the date asked for. Line 171 through 180 talks about the pest wood-destroying insects. This is another inspection I recommend you ask for. Again, if the general home inspector says, there's no need for it, I don't see any evidence, you don't have to do it unless the lender requires it. So again, ask your lender if it's required. I will tell you, if it's a VA loan, VA requires a pest inspection paid for by the seller. They are to arrange for it and pay for it. So you will check seller's choice, buyer's choice. If your buyer's requesting it, again, you want to control the inspection and the paperwork. And that they will have the written report available to the buyer before closing. If there is infestation or damage by pests, termites, or wood-destroying insects, treatment of the condition shall be made by a licensed exterminating agency, which shall furnish a certificate of guarantee for a period of at least 1 year in the case of termites, and certificate of guarantee for a period of at least 60 days in the case of wood-destroying insects. All repairs and treatment costs shall be paid by your buyer or the seller. I recommend the seller, but again, it's your buyer's choice. FHA/VA are going to require the seller to make that payment. This agreement may be voided by the party paying for the repair and treatment if the cost exceeds $500. So if the seller's paying for it and the cost is too high, they can ask for a mutual release. Lines 183 through 194 talk about lead-based paint. Lead-based paint may be present in homes built prior to 1978. If this is a concern of your buyers, then you can request such a test. If it's not a concern, if they don't have young children or they don't feel it's really necessary, then it could be a no. Again, understand what the lead-based paint inspection is all about. Lines 196 through 198 talk about the disclosure of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards and protect your family from lead in your home. It's very important that you make sure your buyer has this. The federal government requires every buyer to receive a copy of this pamphlet. It's in .loop, and you, of course, can send that to your buyer through .loop. If they haven't, you have to check has not and then the number of days. There's no reason not to make sure your buyer has it. Now the loss history report. This is something we added when we redid the contracts about 4 years ago, starting line 206. The loss history report shows any insurance claims for the past 5 years. This is very helpful to your buyer. It will be done by their insurance company before they issue a policy, but it lets them know if anything has transpired that was an insurance claim. So you can do this easily using the form from Liberty Mutual that's in .loop, or you can have the buyer's own insurance company do it. But the parties agree that this contract is subject to the buyer's review and approval of an insurance claims loss history report on the property. The buyer understands and agrees that the buyer will be solely responsible for obtaining the report within 10 days from the date of this agreement. Buyer shall obtain and review the report and either remove this contingency in writing and accept the property as is, or terminate the agreement by written notice to the seller. Why might you terminate? Well, there was a $25,000 insurance claim 2 years ago when these people owned the property for water damage, and yet there's nothing on the disclosure and they don't want to discuss it with you. That could be a red flag. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes people have been known to file a claim for insurance, accept the payment, and never do the repair. So this will protect your buyer. Finally, in line 2, and that ends our inspection contingencies. The next part will begin with line 220 with Megan's Law. If you want more information, watch that video.